Sometimes the cold doesn't take a life. It only waits to see if someone still believes it's worth saving. Dawn has not yet reached the mountains of northern Montana when Ethan Mercer steps onto the frozen shoreline, his boots pressing slow, hollow echoes into a blanket of snow untouched by anyone else. The world feels suspended between darkness and light, wrapped in a silence so complete it almost seems sacred. Pine trees stand motionless beneath coats of white frost, and a pale blue mist drifts low across the lake, softening every edge until earth and sky become one endless sheet of winter. The air burns with every breath, sharp enough to sting his lungs, carrying only the scent of ice, evergreen, and distant wood smoke from cabins hidden beyond the hills. Ethan has spent most of his life trusting what others overlook. Years as a Navy SEAL taught him that danger rarely announces itself. Survival often hides inside the smallest sound. Even now, months after leaving active duty, he still walks before sunrise because silence is the only thing that slows the memories enough for him to breathe. His gloved hands rest inside the pockets of his weathered field jacket while a faint breeze brushes across the frozen lake, whispering over the ice like forgotten voices. Then he hears it. Not a bark, not a cry, just a sound so faint it could have been the wind catching beneath the frozen surface. Ethan stops instantly. Every instinct inside him sharpens. He waits. Nothing. The silence returns, heavy and absolute. He almost convinces himself he imagined it, until another fragile noise rises beneath the morning air, softer than a bird's wing, weaker than a single breath. He steps carefully onto the lake, each footfall measured, every movement slow enough to listen between his own heartbeats. Frost cracks beneath his boots in delicate silver lines stretching across the ice. 20 feet ahead, a strange shape lies half buried beneath drifting snow. At first it looks like a fallen log wrapped in frost. Then he notices the outline of ears. His pulse quickens. He kneels, brushing away powder with steady hands. Black and tan fur appears beneath the ice crystals. A German shepherd. A female. Her body is rigid beneath the frozen blanket, her coat glazed with shimmering frost until she almost disappears into the winter itself. Snow has gathered across her back as though the storm has already claimed her days ago. Ethan removes one glove and presses trembling fingers gently against her neck. Nothing. He lowers his face closer, searching for the faint warmth that every rescue begins with. The cold answers instead. His breath escapes in a slow cloud as he studies the peaceful stillness of the shepherd's face. Her eyelids remain closed. Tiny crystals cling to her whiskers. She looks less like an animal and more like a memory preserved by the mountain itself. Ethan swallows hard. Somewhere deep inside him, an old voice whispers that this mission is already over. Another voice, quieter but stronger, refuses to leave. He brushes the snow from her face with extraordinary care, as though she might still feel kindness even if she cannot feel warmth. His eyes linger on the frozen outline of her muzzle before he leans closer and speaks the words almost as a prayer carried into the silent dawn. She was frozen solid. For a long moment Ethan Mercer does not move. The mountains remain silent around him, their snow-covered peaks glowing faintly beneath the first trace of morning light, while the frozen lake stretches in every direction like polished glass. Most people would have accepted what their eyes were telling them. A body this cold could not survive. A heartbeat this quiet could not return. But Ethan had learned years ago that appearances often lied. During 12 years as a Navy SEAL, he had crawled through deserts that shimmered with impossible heat, crossed oceans beneath moonless skies, and watched teammates endure conditions no human should have survived. The instructors had repeated one lesson until it became instinct. Your mind quits before your body does. Never let your mind make the final decision. That lesson had followed him home after retirement, lingering through sleepless nights and lonely mornings when memories refused to loosen their grip. Since leaving the teams, Ethan had settled into a weathered cabin nearly 15 miles outside the nearest town, hoping the mountains might quiet the battles that still echoed inside him. They never truly did. Every dawn he walked these trails because movement kept the past from standing still. Some mornings he remembered laughter around campfires after successful missions. Other mornings he remembered empty seats that would never be filled again. Those were the mornings that hurt the most. He looked back toward the German shepherd resting beneath the blanket of frost. There was no collar around her neck, only a faint line pressed into the thick fur where one had once been. Someone had cared for her. Someone had called her by a name. That thought settled heavily inside him. Dogs did not simply wander onto frozen lakes without a story. They followed loyalty farther than reason ever could. Ethan brushed another layer of snow from her shoulders, revealing the beautiful sable coat hidden beneath the ice. Even frozen, she carried the unmistakable strength of a working shepherd. Her paws were broad. Her muscles, though stiff with cold, spoke of discipline rather than neglect. She was not old. Perhaps 4 years. Maybe 5. Her ears, though motionless now, still stood with quiet dignity. He studied her face, searching for anything that might explain why she had come here alone. Instead, he found something unexpected. Beneath the frost coating her eyelashes rested an expression that looked strangely peaceful, almost as though she had refused to surrender to fear before sleep claimed her. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had seen that same calm determination in men who chose courage when circumstances offered none. A weak gust swept across the lake, carrying loose snow between them. He reached inside his jacket and removed a faded pair of military dog tags hanging from a worn chain. His thumb traced the cool metal for only a second before slipping them back beneath his sweater. Some promises never stopped weighing on a man. He drew one slow breath, then another, letting the cold sharpen his thoughts instead of clouding them. If there was even the smallest chance she still held on somewhere beneath the silence, he would not leave her here. Carefully sliding both arms beneath her frozen body, Ethan lifted her against his chest. She was heavier than she looked, rigid with ice, yet he held her with the gentleness reserved for something precious. The rising sun finally touched the distant ridge, spilling pale gold across the frozen lake as he turned toward the waiting cabin, carrying not certainty, but hope. The cabin greeted Ethan with the familiar scent of seasoned pine, old leather, and the faint trace of cedar smoke lingering from the previous night's fire. It was small, built decades earlier by a retired park ranger, but every beam carried the quiet strength of things made to endure long winters. Ethan eased the German shepherd onto a thick wool blanket beside the stone fireplace, moving with the same deliberate care he had once used while tending exhausted teammates after long operations. Outside, the wind rattled the frosted windows, urging the temperature farther below freezing, but inside the cabin a new fire slowly awakened, its orange glow pushing back the cold one crackling log at a time. He removed his heavy coat and immediately reached for dry towels from an old wooden cabinet. The frost coating the shepherd's fur sparkled under the firelight before slowly melting into tiny beads of water. Every few moments Ethan paused, searching for the smallest sign that life still lingered beneath the silence. Nothing changed. Her chest remained still. Her body remained painfully cold beneath his hands. Common sense whispered that he had arrived too late. Experience answered differently. He remembered survival instructors repeating that cold could preserve life in ways few people understood. Until certainty existed, surrender was not an option. Ethan carefully wrapped the shepherd in fresh blankets that had been warming beside the fireplace. He filled several cloth bags with warm water from a kettle resting on the cast-iron stove, checking each one against the inside of his wrist before placing them gently near her shoulders, chest, and hind legs. Too much heat too quickly could do more harm than good. Patience mattered now. Everything depended upon patience. The fire continued its quiet conversation with the room, sending gentle waves of warmth across the wooden floor. Steam drifted from the kettle, carrying the comforting aroma of clean water and iron. Ethan knelt beside her, rubbing her legs with slow, steady movements, encouraging warmth to return one careful inch at a time. As the minutes stretched into nearly an hour, he found himself speaking softly, not because he expected an answer, but because silence had become too heavy to carry alone. He told her about the mountains waking outside. He described the sunrise spilling gold across the frozen lake. He spoke about ordinary things, the kind that reminded people they were still part of the world. Somewhere in the middle of those quiet words, his eyes settled again on the faint mark around her neck where a collar had once rested. Whoever she belonged to had almost certainly been searching. That thought strengthened his resolve even more. Every loyal soul deserved someone who refused to give up. Ethan reached for his satellite phone, considering whether to call the county veterinarian, but he hesitated. The nearest clinic lay more than 40 miles away, and icy roads would cost precious time. For now, the best chance she had rested inside this warm cabin. He leaned closer once more, placing 2 fingers gently against the inside of her foreleg. He waited. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10. Just as he began lowering his hand, he thought he felt something so faint it could have been imagination. A whisper beneath the skin. Barely there. So delicate it disappeared before he could trust it. Ethan did not allow hope to race ahead of reason, yet neither did he dismiss what he had sensed. He straightened another blanket around her frozen body, added another log to the fire, and quietly made himself a promise. No matter how long this day became, he would remain beside her until either life returned or the mountains themselves convinced him to let go. Time passed differently inside the cabin. The clock above the fireplace continued its quiet rhythm, but Ethan Mercer measured the morning by smaller things: the soft crackle of burning pine, the slow melting of frost from the German shepherd's coat, and the gentle clouds of his own breath disappearing each time he leaned close enough to search for hers. Outside, the storm clouds had begun to break apart, allowing ribbons of winter sunlight to spill across the snow, yet the warmth never reached beyond the cabin walls. Inside, however, every degree mattered. Ethan replaced the cooling water bags with fresh warm ones, checking each carefully before sliding them beneath the blankets. He knew haste could become its own enemy. Years of training had taught him that discipline was often nothing more than patience practiced under pressure. He continued rubbing her legs and shoulders with slow, steady movements, encouraging circulation without forcing it. Every motion remained gentle, deliberate, almost reverent. The shepherd never stirred. Her ears rested motionless against her head, and her closed eyes reflected the dancing light from the fire as though carved from polished stone. Ethan reached for the old medical kit he always kept stocked, a habit he had never abandoned after leaving military service. He checked her mouth carefully, ensuring her airway remained clear, then rested 2 fingers once again against her chest. There it was. Not a heartbeat strong enough to celebrate, but something so faint it demanded another chance. He waited several more seconds. Again, the tiny rhythm returned, separated by long stretches of silence. Hope entered the room quietly, careful not to frighten itself away. Ethan exhaled a slow breath and whispered, "You are still fighting." He spoke as much to himself as to her. Countless memories drifted through his mind without warning. Faces of teammates who had refused to surrender when every circumstance insisted they should. Men who had survived because someone beside them chose persistence instead of despair. Those lessons had never belonged only to the battlefield. They belonged anywhere life balanced on the edge of disappearing. The fire continued growing stronger until warmth spread across every corner of the room. Steam rose from a mug of untouched coffee cooling on the table, while the scent of cedar mixed with fresh pine and melting snow. Ethan remained beside the shepherd, refusing to waste even a minute. He gently massaged her paws one at a time, feeling the frozen stiffness slowly begin to soften beneath the blankets. It was almost impossible to notice unless someone had been watching from the beginning. Then something changed. One ear twitched so slightly that Ethan almost questioned his own eyes. He froze completely. The movement did not repeat. He leaned closer, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the fire itself. A few seconds passed before the shepherd released the faintest breath, barely visible against the cool air inside the room, yet unmistakably real. It was shallow and fragile, but it belonged to life. Ethan closed his eyes for a single moment, gratitude settling over him like the first sunlight after a long winter night. He did not celebrate. He did not speak loudly. He simply adjusted another blanket around her shoulders, added one more log to the fire, and remained exactly where he had promised he would stay, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories arrived so quietly that only those willing to listen could hear them begin. The afternoon light settled gently across the cabin, turning the rough pine walls the color of warm honey while snow continued drifting beyond the windows in slow, silent waves. Ethan Mercer had not moved far from the fireplace in hours. The mug of coffee beside him had long since grown cold, forgotten beneath the quiet responsibility resting on the blanket before him. Every few minutes he checked the German shepherd again, replacing another warm cloth, adjusting another blanket, speaking another calm sentence into the stillness as though she were simply sleeping through a difficult dream. He never raised his voice. Hope did not need shouting. It only needed someone willing to remain. The tiny heartbeat he had discovered continued its uneven rhythm, faint enough that another person might have missed it entirely. Yet Ethan had learned that life rarely announced its return with certainty. Sometimes it arrived one fragile moment at a time. He rested his hand gently against her shoulder and noticed the stiffness beneath her coat had softened ever so slightly. The warmth inside the cabin was finally reaching places the mountain cold had nearly stolen away. Outside, sunlight reflected across the snow until the entire valley shimmered with quiet brilliance. Inside, the only sounds were the fire, the ticking clock, and Ethan's slow breathing. He found himself remembering something an old combat medic had once said after a rescue mission years before. Miracles do not always happen because everything goes right. Sometimes they happen because someone refuses to leave before they do. Ethan smiled faintly at the memory, then looked back at the shepherd. "Come on," he whispered. "You have made it this far." The words floated softly through the room before disappearing into the crackling fire. Another minute passed, then another. Without warning, the shepherd's nose quivered. It lasted less than a second. Ethan leaned forward, every instinct suddenly awake. He waited without touching her, afraid that even the smallest movement from him might disturb whatever fragile process was unfolding inside her. Her breathing remained shallow, but now each breath arrived a little closer to the next. Color, almost impossible to notice, began returning around her muzzle where the cold had left everything pale. Ethan felt his own heartbeat quicken, though he forced himself to stay calm. Patience had carried them this far. Suddenly one eyelid trembled, then stopped. Ethan did not blink. A few silent seconds later it moved again, this time lingering just long enough for the tiniest sliver of deep brown to appear beneath the lashes before closing once more. He released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "That is it," he said quietly. "Stay with me." As though recognizing the sound of a human voice reaching through the darkness, the shepherd gathered one more fragile breath. Her eyelids slowly lifted again, revealing tired but unmistakably living eyes. They wandered without focus at first, reflecting the orange glow of the fire before finally settling on Ethan's face. Neither of them moved. No dramatic sound filled the room. No impossible miracle announced itself with fanfare. There was only one exhausted dog looking into the eyes of the man who had refused to abandon her, and one former Navy SEAL silently realizing that sometimes the smallest opening of a pair of eyes could feel larger than every victory he had ever known. The first thing the German shepherd noticed was not the fire or the blankets wrapped around her body. It was Ethan's voice. Soft, calm, and steady, it remained the only familiar sound in a world that still felt buried beneath ice. Her eyes struggled to stay open, drifting closed after only a few seconds before slowly finding him again. There was confusion inside them, but not fear. Ethan stayed exactly where he was, careful not to overwhelm her with movement. He simply offered a gentle smile that had become unfamiliar on his own face over the years. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "That is all you need to know today." The words settled into the warm air while the fire continued its patient work, filling the cabin with the comforting scent of burning pine. Outside, fresh snow floated silently across the valley, covering every footprint leading back toward the frozen lake. It was as though the mountain itself wanted to erase the place where everything had nearly ended. Ethan reached for a shallow bowl of warm water and gently moistened the shepherd's dry nose before offering only a few drops against her lips. She responded with the slightest movement of her tongue, weak but determined. It was enough. Every tiny improvement felt like another sunrise. He resisted the temptation to rush her recovery. Experience had taught him that healing respected no schedule except its own. As the hours passed, the color slowly returned beneath her thick sable coat. Her breathing settled into a steadier rhythm, and from time to time her ears twitched toward the crackling fireplace whenever a log shifted in the flames. Ethan found himself talking more than he had spoken in weeks. He described the mountains beyond the cabin windows, the family of deer that often crossed the meadow at dusk, and the pair of bald eagles that nested along the river every spring. The shepherd listened without moving, her tired eyes following every sound as though reminding herself that the world still existed beyond the cold darkness she had escaped. Late that afternoon, she made her first real attempt to lift her head. The effort lasted only a moment before exhaustion pulled her back onto the blanket. Yet Ethan could not hide the quiet pride spreading across his face. "Easy," he whispered. "There is no race anymore." She blinked slowly, almost as if she understood. He noticed something remarkable then. Every time he started to stand, her eyes searched for him. Every time he returned, her breathing relaxed again. Trust, fragile as morning frost, had already begun to form between them. Ethan realized he could not continue calling her simply the shepherd. Every living soul deserved a name. He looked toward the cabin window where the last light of day painted the snow with silver and pale blue. The sky seemed endless, calm after the storm that had nearly claimed her. "Nova," he said softly, testing the sound. "I think that fits you." One ear lifted just enough to acknowledge the unfamiliar word before settling again. Ethan smiled. "Welcome back, Nova." The name lingered gently inside the room, carried by the warmth of the fire and the peaceful silence that followed. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan did not feel alone inside the cabin. And for the first time since opening her eyes, Nova rested without fighting the darkness, because somewhere deep within her recovering heart, she already knew that when she awakened again, the man who had refused to leave her would still be sitting right there beside the fire. 3 mornings passed before Nova gathered enough strength to stand. The attempt lasted only a few seconds, her front legs trembling beneath her weight before Ethan gently guided her back onto the blanket. She looked almost embarrassed by her own weakness, lowering her head with quiet frustration. Ethan smiled and rested a reassuring hand against her shoulder. "You have nothing to prove," he said. "You already survived the hardest part." His words were met by a slow blink that seemed to carry more understanding with each passing day. Outside, winter still ruled the mountains, but the fierce winds had softened into calm breezes that carried loose snow from the pine branches and sparkling clouds. Sunlight poured through the cabin windows each morning, painting warm rectangles across the wooden floor where Nova liked to rest while the fire quietly crackled nearby. Healing had settled into a gentle rhythm. Warm meals, fresh water, short walks across the room, long hours of sleep. Every sunrise returned another small piece of the strong German shepherd Ethan believed she had once been. Yet one question remained unanswered. Who had she belonged to? One afternoon, while brushing the last traces of tangled fur from around her neck, Ethan noticed something hidden beneath the thick sable coat. His fingers paused. There, almost completely concealed, rested a narrow strip of weathered leather. It was not a full collar, only the broken portion that had somehow remained after the buckle and strap had torn away. Carefully, he eased it free without causing discomfort. Attached to the leather by a tiny rusted ring was a small brass tag no larger than a quarter. Years of scratches and winter weather had nearly erased the engraving, but after wiping it clean with the corner of a towel, faint letters slowly appeared beneath the light. Nova watched him quietly, as though she understood this tiny object carried part of the story neither of them yet knew. Ethan carried the tag to the kitchen window where the afternoon sun fell brightest. He tilted the brass several times before the worn inscription finally became readable. On one side was a single word, Grace. Not a name, a word. He frowned gently. Turning the tag over, he discovered another line that had survived beneath the scratches. If found, call Pastor Michael. Below those words remained only the final 4 digits of a telephone number. The rest had disappeared beneath years of wear. Ethan stood motionless, studying the little piece of brass resting in his palm. Grace. The word echoed quietly through the room. It felt less like identification and more like a promise someone had hoped would never be forgotten. He looked toward Nova. Her ears had lifted for the first time since arriving at the cabin. She was watching the tag with complete attention. Then, almost instinctively, she rose onto unsteady legs and slowly crossed the room toward him. Every step required determination, yet she never looked away from the small brass circle in his hand. When she reached him, she gently pressed her nose against it and closed her eyes. Ethan felt her breathing deepen as though an old memory had awakened somewhere beyond words. He knelt beside her without speaking. There was no need. Whatever had happened before the frozen lake, Nova had not wandered there by accident. Someone had loved her enough to leave behind a single word that had outlasted the storm itself. Ethan slipped the tag carefully into his pocket, his thoughts already turning toward the nearest church and the possibility that somewhere beyond these mountains, someone was still searching, still hoping, and perhaps still whispering a prayer for the faithful German shepherd who had finally found her way back from the edge of winter. The following morning dawned clear and still, with a bright winter sun resting above the mountains as though the storm had never existed. Ethan Mercer tucked the weathered brass tag carefully into the pocket of his flannel shirt before helping Nova into the passenger seat of his aging pickup truck. She moved more confidently now, though each step remained cautious, her strength returning little by little with every passing day. She settled onto the folded blanket Ethan had placed across the seat and quietly watched the snow-covered landscape drift by as they followed the narrow two-lane road toward the small mountain town nearly 20 miles away. The drive felt peaceful. Pine forests stretched endlessly on both sides, their branches sparkling beneath fresh snow, while distant peaks stood against a sky so blue it hardly seemed real. Ethan glanced toward Nova several times during the trip. She no longer looked like the motionless shepherd he had carried from the frozen lake. Her ears stood alert. Her eyes followed every passing ranch, every mailbox, every weathered fence. Yet whenever the truck slowed near a church or farmhouse, she leaned forward slightly, searching with quiet expectation before settling back again. It was as though fragments of memory floated just beyond her reach. The town itself was small enough that nearly everyone recognized Ethan with a friendly wave. After years in the military, he had chosen this quiet place because no one asked many questions. He parked beside a modest white church whose wooden steeple rose above the surrounding pines. A simple sign near the entrance read Grace Community Church. Ethan paused before opening the truck door. The single word resting on the brass tag suddenly carried new meaning. Nova stepped carefully onto the snowy ground and lifted her nose into the crisp air. For several silent seconds, she remained completely still. Then her tail gave one slow, uncertain movement. Ethan noticed immediately. Together they walked toward the front entrance where an elderly man wearing a thick wool coat was sweeping fresh snow from the steps. His silver hair peeked beneath a knitted cap, and his gentle smile appeared before Ethan had spoken a single word. "Good morning," the man said warmly. "Beautiful day the Lord has given us." Ethan returned the smile before reaching into his pocket. "I hope you can help me," he replied softly, placing the worn brass tag into the man's hand. The elderly pastor adjusted his glasses and looked down. The moment his eyes reached the engraved word, his expression changed completely. Surprise gave way to recognition, and recognition quietly became emotion. He looked from the tag to the German shepherd standing beside Ethan. His eyes glistened with tears he did not attempt to hide. "I know this tag," he whispered. He slowly knelt despite the cold, holding out a trembling hand toward Nova. She studied him for only a heartbeat before stepping forward and gently resting her head beneath his palm. The pastor closed his eyes as though offering a silent prayer. "We never stopped hoping," he said at last, his voice barely louder than the wind moving through the pines. Ethan felt the weight of those simple words settle deep within his heart. Whatever story had led Nova onto that frozen lake was far from over. In that quiet churchyard, surrounded by snow, faith, and the steady warmth of human kindness, the first real piece of her forgotten journey had finally found its way home. The elderly pastor remained silent for a long moment, his weathered hand resting gently upon Nova's head while the winter wind carried the faint sound of church bells across the valley. Finally, he looked toward Ethan Mercer with grateful eyes that seemed to hold years of stories. "Her real name is Grace," he said softly. "She belonged to a young volunteer here named Emily. Every Saturday, they visited families who lived alone in these mountains. Grace never missed a single visit. She had a gift for finding people who needed comfort before anyone else knew they were hurting." Ethan listened without interrupting. The words settled quietly inside him. The pastor smiled through the emotion gathering in his voice. About 2 months ago, Emily accepted a teaching position in another state. The family caring for Grace during the move believed she had slipped away into the forest after a heavy snowstorm. Search teams looked for days. We prayed every Sunday that someone would find her, or at least know she was not alone. He looked down at the faithful German shepherd, who gazed back with calm brown eyes as though she recognized every word. I never imagined she survived this long. Ethan reached into his jacket and carefully handed the pastor the remaining piece of worn leather. She almost did not, he admitted quietly. The pastor nodded, understanding more than the simple sentence revealed. They spent the next hour inside the little church, sharing warm coffee while sunlight poured through stained glass windows, filling the sanctuary with gentle colors that danced across the wooden pews. Nova rested peacefully beside Ethan, yet every few moments she wandered to the pastor, accepting a kind hand across her back before returning again. It became clear that she remembered this place. She remembered these people. But when the pastor gently opened the church door and invited her to stay, Nova paused on the threshold. She looked inside. Then she turned around and walked back to Ethan, pressing her shoulder lightly against his leg. No command had been given. No leash guided her. It was simply a choice made with complete trust. The pastor smiled knowingly. Sometimes, he whispered, being found changes where home is. Ethan looked down at Nova, and she looked up at him with quiet certainty. Neither of them needed words. As the afternoon sun settled across the snow-covered churchyard, the pastor placed the little brass tag back into Ethan's hand. Keep this with her, he said. Grace is not only the name she once carried. It is the reason she is still here. Ethan fastened the tag carefully onto a new leather collar he purchased from the small feed store before they drove back toward the mountains. The golden light followed them through the pine forests until the cabin finally appeared beyond the trees. That evening, Nova lay peacefully beside the fireplace, her head resting near Ethan's boots while the flames filled the room with warmth. Outside, winter continued covering the world in quiet white silence. Inside, two souls who had both carried invisible burdens finally rested without fear. Ethan looked into the fire, then down at the faithful German shepherd sleeping beside him, and realized that not every miracle arrived with thunder or applause. Some arrived as a single steady heartbeat, a pair of trusting eyes, and the quiet grace of never giving up on someone who could no longer ask to be saved.